Want to talk about the Vita Nova, the Changeling years? It's 26 to 38. I was skimming through this prior to our meeting, just trying to recall some of the things that are in this, and I would agree that this is the best of the true life books. It has more complex structures than the previous ones. Generally, a memory would lead into a poem or an anecdote about a poem, and this one has more complex, kind of varied structures. As an example, Sandfreud uses snippets of poems to talk about the idea of abortion, not necessarily abortion itself, but abortion. I wanted you to talk about that because it seems like the tropes in the previous True Life books, particularly the first one, were more as a means to lead into a poem. They were still relatively more complex to most other published things. I'm just talking about how you made the tropes more a coalition of different ideas, and the structures are more intertwined in this one than the previous ones. It does seem like it has kind of a gradual arc, just as you've stated before, where you can see how you're growing from one memoir to the next.
So what exactly? I mean, I don't know what you mean. I mean, it's basically it's just getting more complex. I mean, there was no particular plan. I mean, I'll put more things in. I experiment a little bit more. I mean, you'd have to talk to me about a particular thing. I mean, sang-froid, meaning cold blood. Let's see, 622. So this looks like it's about. Is this when I kicked the ass of that guy at the abortion clinic, pushed him down the stairs?
Yes.
Yeah. So.
Well, it's using the snippets in between the poems instead of just having a memory that leads into a whole poem.
Yeah.
You're using it more as snippets, and we'll talk about a memoir later called Days, where you use that one of what I think is one of your best essays called The Day against just typical days that you have led in your life. Well, this one kind of has a similar structure to that.
I don't think that. I mean, like this particular memoir about the time I took this girl Magdalia to an abortion clinic, and I mean, it's just trying to do different things. The current book I'm writing, you're always competing against yourself. One of the things I've always told Jessica is one of the downsides of being a great writer is that you're competing against your prior self, and there's also a tendency to get complacent and just do the same things that have worked all the time. I mean, there are times like when I've read Jessica's books, and I'll read maybe, she's got maybe 12, 15 novels that she's written, and all but the first two have at least arguments for greatness, and she's probably got 10 or 12 of them that are definitively great. And, you know, you get to a point that the thing that if it was the first book that you saw from someone you'd never read before, you'd be blown away by. You're sort of like, oh, this is more greatness from that person. And so this is one of the things that I've always tried to do is try to from book to book, from poem to poem, try to always switch things up. I don't recall the particular reason that I broke this up. I mean, I think this one is from Shatoya Sings a Martian Ode. This poem, and I broke it up. I think by stanzas. And again, it's one of those things. We're talking now over a dozen years ago that I wrote it, so I don't even recall necessarily. I mean, in my mind, I know what happened at the things, but like I had said in an earlier interview, I'd have to look at the names of the people and the incidents to try to remember who was who, because having to change the names, you know, fucks things up a bit. So. What became of the foolish notion of the soul? Quality of life? I shall not waste. I'm pro-abortion. I finish my shit. So yeah, I'm talking about the bullshit of being pro-abortion rather than pro-choice. So it's basically just experimentation. You just can't do the same things over and over again. Even when I've done whole books of sonnets, the American sonnets or the holy sonnets, you try to play with forms. You try to play with approach. You try to play with all kinds of things. As I mentioned, this current book I'm doing is basically 27 chapters of a spy talking about different aspects of his life and remembering them. And so it's not necessarily a direct, straight narrative. So I sort of like think of it like if you were at a block party or some big thing where they have those multicolored banners in a row, and so the banners start off thick and they taper to the end and they're all hanging down, and 27 colored banners sort of flowing against one another and at a certain angle, and people have to divine a narrative. So you just have to always experiment. Again, unless you had a specific question, you just have to do things differently. And so in each of the books, my writing and my thought process got a little bit more complex over the months, and I did one that was all missives, all letters, and so you just try to do different things. So you try to sometimes do it in first. I think I did 2 or 3 of these memoirs in second person, where you, we, which is very difficult to do. Writing in second person is probably the most difficult of the perspectives to write from. Uh, Third person is generally what most books are. Occasionally you'll get the first person, which makes up, I mean, third person is probably 95% of all narratives. Third person is probably 4.9%, and 0.1% might be second person, and that's very rarely in fiction. You might get that more in drama, but
You've used first person quite a bit in your later books, which are more metaphysical. Do you think that lends itself to that type of experimentation? Because if you're, I'm currently reading Norwegian in a family, in the family, and it has many metaphysical tropes. It will have the whole design of Dan Schneider against Manny Cole, and it's something that I think would be best that doesn't just use first person like I would think it would. It has a third person narrative, and it kind of just jumps around throughout that. So you're using actually multiple perspectives, even though the background feeling of it is in third person.
well,
Do you think that people can sometimes get a little too dualistic in terms of how they use the perspectives? Because your work has multiple perspectives, not just first, second, and third exclusively, but all three at times.
yeah, and third, well, with second person, you can only use really the second person. You can't really go third person. You can have multiple narrators in chapters or even in sections of a poem or something. You can have chorus, anti-chorus, with people talking in the third person. First person is probably more interesting when you do multiple perspectives, because you have the eye is more fluid. When you have third person, you can more easily distinguish the characters, because the narrator is usually looking at the character as if he's on a film screen. But when you're in the first person, you're behind the eyes, and you can play with the idea of if you switch from one first person to another first person, where does that switch become? And so that probably gives more of a poetic, fluid movement to the way a narrative is exposed. But again, it's just a matter of playing with it. The thing that's so frustrating is that when I read stuff, it's so predictable. Let me give you an example, and I'm actually going to write an essay about this. I think I mentioned earlier interviews this essay I written about this woman named Maggie Estep. She was a poet with the New Eurekan Poets back in the late 80s, early 90s that I knew, and she died a couple of years ago, and I wrote an essay about 6 months after her death, when I just found out about her death. And so I was looking a couple of days ago, and I found out another woman that I had known had died. Her name was Judith Kitchen. And I had met her in 1987 at the Brockport Writers Festival in upstate New York at Brockport University, the State University of New York. She and her husband, a guy named Stan Rubin, ran this festival. This is where I met that William Matthews guy. And she was, a very nice woman, but she had no real particular writing talent. She was probably best in writing essays. She would write, I guess she called them sort of personal essays, but they were nowhere in a league with a James Baldwin or Lauren Isley. At best, they were good, solid. Her poetry wasn't necessarily doggerel, but it was utterly generic. Her fiction that I read was mediocre, but again, she was a nice woman. And I looked and I saw all these writings of praise for her. She wrote reviews for 20 plus years for like the Georgia Review, which is one of these college magazines that has maybe a circulation of 2 or 3,000, 98% of which ends up in college libraries that nobody reads. And when she died, the Los Angeles Review of Books apparently had four no-name MFA writers basically writing about how influential she was and what a great critic she was. And I've actually got some of her stuff. I'm going to have to tear it apart. And I do it so with hesitation because, again, she was a nice woman. But there's this fucking tendency to always overpraise, not even mediocrity, but sub-mediocre writing just because you like the person. And this is the frustrating thing is you can see in her writing, especially her poetry, which is the weakest of all of her writing, an absolute lack of understanding of taking, experimenting, playing. Words are supposed to be goddamn fun. You get none of that in her writing. Her husband, a guy named Stan Rubin, was in some ways even more guilty of that. And anyway, so it's something that's very frustrating because you see these people that don't experiment, and you can look in, if you just look in any of the four books of True Life, which were my first four prose books, there's more experimentation with the prose line, with mixing prose and poetry, with proems, etc., than you're going to find, I think, in any other writer out there. We mentioned Paul Metcalf, Melville's great grandson or something, who's supposedly a writer of experimentation, but he was not a particularly good writer, and he wasn't even really that experimental compared to what I did in this earliest of works. So it's just very frustrating because people don't experiment, and this is experimental, if you want to say, but it's highly readable. This is one of the things that people who they think experimental means bullshit like the Bob Grummans and the Bill Bissets and these kinds of people that just play with typewriters and put shit all over the thing. This is one of the major problems with art is that experimental basically means no talent. It means just fucking around and trying to fob off your mind farts on other people rather than actually giving something back to people. So that's sort of the end of my little speech there.